Hello, hi ladies.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you guys?
Good.
Doing good?
Oh, yeah.
I actually have the chat up today, so I realized yesterday I failed to get the chat up and I missed all the great chats. I saw them afterwards. I was like, oh, this is really great information. So I will make sure to have that up today. I think, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Jordan who had shared yesterday about how to see the calendar. Did you guys all see that on the chat yesterday? So she had shared that there's a location on Blackboard that you can go. You can see it in the grade book, but there's also a location that is a calendar location on your left navigation bar, and where you can pull up the calendar. So you guys could explore for that, or you can just use the syllabus. The syllabus is probably the easy way to go. I hope you guys all got your, I haven't looked, I haven't been on, I had some meetings this morning, but I hope you guys all got your introductory discussions done yesterday. Did everybody get theirs done?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And so, and I saw yesterday that a couple of people had already done the quiz, so that's awesome. And a couple of people had done the homework too. So just remember that you have to get your quiz and your homework for lecture 1 completed by the end of the day today. Does anyone have any questions about lecture 1 or any of the material? Or maybe you took the quiz already and you, well, we probably shouldn't talk about that because there might be some people who haven't taken the quiz yet. But if anybody just has some questions, and what I'll do tomorrow is I can actually pull the quiz up if people have questions about specific items on the quiz, and I can pull it up and we can actually look at them if someone has some questions about any of the items on the quiz or the homework. Okay, does that sound good?
I do have, like, could you explain again the difference between descriptive and inferential statistics?
Yes. So descriptive statistics are just describing a group. So it would be like averages, you know, it would be like telling you how many males and females are in the group, or how many people smoke. It might be telling you about what their average cholesterol is. So it's just all this information that's telling you about that group. So Rachel, remember the second, I'm sorry, the first abstract we looked at yesterday about the soccer players, and it just, you know, they collected a lot of data about those soccer players, and then they were describing what happened when they were in match play, you know, or when they were, you know, whether they were elite or non-elite players. It just described all of these things about them. So those are all descriptive statistics. Okay. So anything that describes a group is descriptive statistics. So that's pretty easy. Now the inferential statistics, that's when you're either comparing two groups to see if they're similar, or if you're comparing two groups or more to see if they're different. So if you're actually looking for interpretations of the descriptive data, so you have all this descriptive data and then you want to say, well, you know, did the non-elite players have lower, you know, VO2s than the elite players? We can compare those. That's inferential statistics.
Okay.
Okay. So when we're trying to make inferences, when we're trying to like understand or make some decisions, the statistics we use there, that's the inferential statistics. So that would be like correlations, or a t-test, which tests for differences, regressions, and you don't have to know what these mean yet. You're going to learn about them, but all of those tests test to see if there's relationships or differences among groups of people.
Okay.
So that's the inferential statistics. So if you see in a study, and like yesterday, both of those studies had descriptive statistics and they both had inferential statistics, because even in the first one, even though it was descriptive research and it had a lot of descriptive data, they did look at the non-elite versus the elite on a few things, right? They did compare them. That's inferential statistics, but they didn't do it in an experimental way. They didn't have like a control group, right? They didn't manipulate a variable. So it was still descriptive research, but they used some inferential statistics.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Any other questions before we get started? Okay, great. So just want to remind you to work on getting those the quiz and the homework done by the end of the day. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen for our lecture for the day. So today we're going to be extending some more information about research design and literature review. Okay, so can you guys see the lecture?
Not yet. No.
Are you seeing this screen? Okay, not the lecture. Okay, so what about if I move the lecture? Can you see the lecture now?
Yes. It was just saying that you were sharing the screen and then it popped up.
Oh, so it's here now?
Yes.
You see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me move this other stuff onto I have two screens, so I'm trying to move them around so I can oh, I can't do that. It won't let me do it. Hang on. Let me move this back. Okay, so let me see. So you seeing it now? Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. The weird thing is when I do the screen, oh, there it is. I was going to say when I do the screen share, then it like hides my chat. So let me see if I can move this chat to my other screen and if that will work. Okay. So now I think I'm good. Okay, so can you see, you guys can see the screen now? Yes. Okay. Okay, so today we're going to be talking a little bit more about design and lit review. So we're going to go a little bit more in depth than what we did yesterday. So you can see the performance objectives that we're going to be really delving a little bit more into the stages of research and some of the tools that we would use and how to complete a lit review. So this kind of goes along a little bit with, we talked about the scientific method yesterday, where we talked about finding a problem and then developing a hypothesis and then testing the hypothesis, collecting data, testing the hypothesis, and then coming up with, do we accept or reject our hypothesis? So so that's the scientific method. But if you look at the stages in the review process, it's kind of similar. You're going to be selecting a problem, analyzing that problem, whether it's through descriptive research or experimental research, through your research strategy. So you're going to develop, what strategy am I going to use and what instruments or tools am I going to use to measure, okay? Then you're going to gather the data. Then you're going to actually test the hypothesis with inferential statistics. Okay, so when you interpret the data, you can analyze the data and get a lot of descriptive statistics, but you're always going to do some kind of inferential test in order to interpret the data or test your hypothesis. So if your hypothesis is like, some of the ideas we talked about yesterday that say exercise can lower cholesterol or exercise lowers your risk for heart disease. Okay, we would have to do an inferential test in order to answer that question. We couldn't just look at the two averages and then just guess. Just because one might be a little higher than the other, I have to actually apply mathematical probability to that for me to be able to say with a surety that one is higher than the other, or one, the exercise actually reduced heart disease risk versus non-exercise, okay? So I have to be able to interpret that data by using inferential statistics. And then I would report those results. So I would write them up in a lab, report format, and I may disseminate that information, say, at my school or in my company, or I might actually publish that data. Now, a lot of you might be saying, oh, well, I'm never going to publish data, but that might not be true. I mean, you might work at a company where they do research and you are involved in a research study, or you might reach out to somebody at a university in your local area that could help you to do your research or help you get your research published if you feel like, wow, I did this research and it was really valuable. For instance, I had a student doing her field experience or her internship a couple years ago, and she was coaching soccer at one of the high schools in Pueblo. And she was really interested in motivation. Like, how do I get my players motivated? And so she did a study on grit. Like, how do I develop grit in my players and motivation? And so she used some techniques that were known in the literature that were shown to improve motivation and grit, or toughness, mental toughness. And so she did a pre-test where she tested their mental toughness or their grit. And then she employed the different strategies. And then she did a post-test. And then she saw whether their mental toughness or their grit increased. So even though she didn't have a control group, which is what you need for a true experimental, she had what we call a quasi-experimental project with no control group. And she collected the data and she analyzed it herself. I helped her a little bit, make sure she had it set up correctly. And then I was like, you know what, this is really good research, because she found out that she actually increased, she saw an increase in her athletes' mental toughness and grit with the techniques she used, the coaching techniques. And then we ended up getting that published. So she was able to disseminate the research that she did as an undergraduate student, which I thought was really great, to other coaches. So we published it in a regional journal for that a lot of PE teachers and a lot of coaches read. And she was able to share her outcomes of using these techniques. So she was like, oh my gosh, I never dreamt that I would actually publish an article. But she did, because she did some good work. And, she got some help from me, some guidance, but she did it. And she was the first author on the article. And it was really exciting for her to be able to do that. So you never know when you might be able to, report results of what you're involved in, or you might be involved in some projects or some research. Okay. So that's really the typical process. And so when we get into that process and we're using the scientific method and we're getting into descriptive or experimental research, the first thing we have to do is we have to figure out what is a potential research problem. Like, what is something that I want to find the answer to, right? That I want to get more in depth. I want to research, okay? So in this class, we're actually going to be doing a research project, okay? So we want to find out, like, what is it that we might want to research, okay? Now, in the summer session, I usually encourage the group, and especially since we're online and remote, I encourage the group, we might want to do something like a survey, because it will be a lot easier to do remotely. We all can be involved in it versus some of the other studies that I've done in semester past, we've done some things like one summer we did, does sitting on an exercise ball keep you more attentive in class than sitting on just a regular chair? So we did a mixed design where we had half the class sitting on a chair and half the class sitting on an exercise ball. And then it switched every week. We did actually a mixed design, but we could have just said like half the class is going to sit on the exercise chair, half the class isn't. And then we actually had people rate their perception mid-class and then at the end of class of how much they were paying attention, like what their attention level was. So we did that throughout the whole 4 weeks, and then we gathered data on that, and then the students were able to analyze that data and write up a lab report on that. But since we're not together and we're not able to, like one semester in a long semester, we did a kind of a cool thing to see if sugar intake impacted anaerobic activity. So we divided the class into two. I randomly assigned the class to group A and group B, and then they drank. We did a baseline, how many push-ups they could do in a minute. Okay, so we had them do anaerobic activity, push-ups, and how many push-ups could they do in a minute. Okay, and so we got a baseline, and then the two groups got a drink, a sugar substance. So one group got a drink that was non-sugar, and one group got a drink that had sugar in it. And both of the drinks had aspartame in them, so they both had that taste of a sugar substitute. Because I was like, yeah, we need to do that in order for them to blind, right? Because we wanted to blind it so they wouldn't know whether they were getting the sugar or not. Okay. And then after they drank the sugar substitute, we waited 20 minutes and then they did the push-ups again. So then we tried to see, did that increase the number of push-ups they could do? Did that have an effect? So, those are some ideas of what we've done in the past. And that was just born out of students saying like, what are you interested in? Like I just asked students, what are you interested in? What would be an interesting thing for you to study? So what I want to ask you guys today, and I know we don't have a whole lot of the class today. Let's see, we've got 5 people here today out of the 10 or 9. I guess we have 9 people, and that's okay because we're just going to chat. So on the chat feature, if you guys could type in, like, I know Catherine shared with us that she's interested in global health. Rachel is in physical education. I know, who was it? Is Adriana, is it you that's doing psychology?
No.
It is you?
No.
Okay, so I know you guys have varied interests, but so use your chat function, and I just want you to talk about what are just interesting topics to you. Okay, like for me, I'm interested in meditation and mindfulness and how that affects people's ability to be organized and be able to cope with stress. So that's a real interest of mine. I'm also interested in obesity and how mental and emotional health affects your risk for obesity. So those are some research interests of mine. I mean, I actually have a lot of things that I'm just really interested in around people's mental health and how it affects their physical health. But so just go ahead and type in, what are some of the things that you're just interested in? Like, you're just like, I wonder about this. I just have interest in this topic. So it could just be topical. So just type in, what are some of the things you're interested in? Maybe it is obesity. Maybe it's performance, like athletic performance. Maybe it's mental health. Maybe it's social justice. Maybe it's chronic communicable disease. Maybe it's improving water in international communities. Improving access to water. It could be anything. So just go ahead and type in some of the things that you're interested in. so I can get a feel. Okay, so Rachel is interested in how early health education can affect a child's perception on healthy lifestyles later in life. Okay, that's very interesting. I am interested in that also. I'm, specifically, Rachel, I'm kind of interested in how maybe sexuality education, like even in like starting in 5th grade, appropriate sexuality education, starting 5th, 6th, 7th grade. And does that affect people's perceptions of sex later in life? Or does it maybe affect their risk level? Like, do they have lower risks? Did they actually have less risky behavior as they moved into adulthood? I've always wondered about that. Like, does having healthy sexual, healthy perceptions of sex um, help them later in life to make decisions versus like, just don't think about sex. That's dirty and nasty, versus, okay, sex is normal. Men, women, you can start with young kids talking about just the difference between genders, just basic things about their body, things like that. So I've had questions about that too, but it could be even about eating, like early education about nutrition. Did that affect their nutritional choices later in life? Or did more of their family, like what they ate at home, maybe cultural food choices, did that have more of effect on their choices? So things like that. That's very interesting to me also. Anybody else? What are some of the things you guys are interested in?
Right now, born and raised in Boulder, almost like I know multiple people that have dealt with eating disorders, and I kind of just want to know why and like how all of that really works. I'm interested in that.
Okay. So, I'm going to go back. I kind of lost you guys for a second. I think my internet is a little spotty. Nicole is interested in how exercise can improve mental health. I think that's really great. Really, really great. Especially like body work, like doing something that involves kind of even the mental and the body, like doing something like yoga or like Tai Chi or Qigong or something like that. Can be really mindful movement. And that's kind of interesting too, to see if that has an effect more, if that has more of effect than say something like running or lifting weights. I don't know, that would be interesting. Courtney says that she's interested in learning about anything and something health related like mental health and physical health. I too am very interested in that, Courtney, like just how those things connect. And then Adriana, keto diet, why does it work so well? Or fast? Is it healthier or worse than other diets? Great research. I'm also very interested, and there's a lot of research coming out in the last few years, like new research coming out in the last few years about fasting, about intermittent fasting and using like a eat for 8 hours, don't eat for 16 hours kind of approach, where you have, you eat really healthy, early lunch, maybe a snack and then a dinner, and then you don't eat between 7 at night till like 11 in the morning or 10:30 in the morning. So there's a lot more research coming out about that too, which is really interesting. A lot of stuff about nutrition is really interesting. Let's see, teen pregnancy, better sexual education. Yeah, age appropriate. That's good too. Mental health with foreign communities, anxiety, social issues. That's great. Even interfacing like violence in this, people that live in kind of war-torn areas, people that live in with cultural unrest, that puts even more stress and pressure when people are living with, like, say, civil war in their country between two cultures. it's, you know, the research shows that that's even more stressful than if you're in a country where you're warring against, say, another country, where you're kind of united as a country. So you have that togetherness. So things like that are really interesting too. Okay, so it looks like almost everybody weighed in. Okay, so really interesting topics. And so as we look through, as we look through these topics, oh, and Rachel put mental health and eating disorders. I'm super interested in eating disorders also. Very, very interested in eating disorders. And think it's, yeah, like what cues that? I mean, is there even anything, maybe something genetic or something in brain chemistry that could be around that? Because we do know that there is some genetic component to say, like bipolar conditions and depression, to some other mental health conditions. So is there something around that with eating disorders? You know, or what are the cues that cue it? Like maybe if somebody is at risk, but they're doing fine, and then all of a sudden they get cued into unhealthy eating behavior. So what is that? What causes that? So those are all really interesting things. So if we look at the chat and we look at these different topics, which one of these topics do you think might lend itself to us doing a survey? So I'm thinking we could do a survey. Since we have such a small class, we only have 9 people in the class. If each person gets 10 surveys, can collect 10 surveys, then we can get 90 or more surveys. That will give us enough data that we could actually analyze and get some, you know, good outcomes. Like if we only surveyed say we only surveyed the people in the class and we only had 9 surveys, that's not going to be enough data for us to have validity, okay? Because in order to do the analysis, you have to have a certain number of people in your group or in your groups, okay? So we would definitely want to have, like, you know, 80 to 100 surveys in order for us to have, especially if we end up having like a way to group them. Like maybe if we did something with eating disorders, we could look at men versus women, you know, or maybe we could look at any other ideas. Like let's say, since it might be easiest for you guys to get surveys from other college students, like from people you know, then if we're looking at the college age group, how could we divide that up if we wanted to have 2 groups that we compared against for, say, eating disorders? Like we could look at men and women, but what might be some other ways we could divide the group up?
Traditional versus non-traditional college students.
Okay, so we could divide it up by age. Yeah, so and it wouldn't even have to be necessarily college students. We could just say people from 18 to 30, and then people from 30 to 50 or something, you know. And then we could look at, is there a difference in the age groups on their either behavior or perception around eating disorders? Or maybe we want to throw in uh, body image with that, and maybe look at, is there a difference in body perceptions? Because we know that that's a factor in eating disorders, is body image and perception of the person's body. So maybe we could throw that in and see, hey, is there a difference in age groups on the perception of body image? You know, that's something we could think about. We could maybe divide it up by ethnicity. You know, we could look and see if different ethnic groups have different perceptions around or different behaviors around eating, right? Or body image. That could be really interesting. We could look at whether they were athletes or not. You know, that would be kind of an interesting thing, like somebody that had been or what is an athlete, considers themselves an athlete, versus somebody who's not, doesn't consider themselves an athlete. Does that have a factor in it? right? So we could look at our population that we decide to work with, and we could say, okay, how can we divide them up? But then also, what specifically might we be looking at? You know, could it be that we're looking at perceptions of body image, or perceptions or actual behavior around food, around eating behavior, or around purging behavior, or around, you know, not eating? So there's, you know, we could look specifically about, you know, people that, especially like I just brought up the whole intermittent fasting, for some people that throws them into anorexic behavior, right? They start getting like addicted to fasting. You know, they're like, oh, this is so great. You know, this is really helping me. And then they take it overboard, right? And then they end up with some disordered patterns where they're not eating for long periods, that kind of thing. So we have to be aware of that. Like if I'm working with a person that's wanting to lose weight, I'm going to want to find out a lot about them before I would suggest like intermittent fasting. Because if I know that person's had some history with uh, uh, anorexia, I would never encourage them to use intermittent fasting. Okay. Because that could be really bad for their mental health. It could really kind of send them over the edge. Okay. I mean, it might not if they're really in a healthy place at that point, but I would want to really talk to them about that and say, that might not be a good pattern for you to use at this point. Right. And we would maybe come up with something different. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. And I'm wanting to jump into my coaching hat. But we're in the stats class now, so we should move on. So that would definitely be like yeah, and somebody, Rachel mentioned geographic location or income level. Catherine mentioned income level. All of those things would be really great. Also like freshmen versus seniors, which would also be age related. Athletes versus non-athletes. Those are all great ways we could divide this up. Okay. So if we look at the topics, I think that the whole eating disorder thing, that could be a good survey. Like we could come up with some good questions. There's already some good tools out there around body image. And we could probably find a good survey tool around like eating behavior, around like eating disorders. So we wouldn't have to recreate the wheel, right? We could find some surveys that were already in place and had already been validated and tested. And then we could use those surveys together with like then asking what their age is, or what their ethnicity is, or whether they're an athlete or not, or what their income level is, or that kind of thing. That would help us divide them up into groups. Okay, so that's a possible project for our class. Okay. The other one I'm seeing that might be interesting, that it would be doable, is doing something maybe about what kind of health education people had when they were younger, and then compare that to their behaviors today. So maybe something around diet, or maybe something around, I mentioned getting sexuality education, maybe something around even, did they ever have any education about healthy relationships? Has that affected the relationships they've had? I don't know. So that could be a possibility about finding out, what kind of education did they have in schools, say around diet, and then what's their diet like, and we could divide it up between people who had education in school versus people that didn't have any education in school. And that's why I kind of bring up sexuality health education, because a lot of people didn't get any sex ed in school. And most people got some kind of nutritional education in school at some level. And it would probably take more than what we can do in one survey to kind of ferret that out. Just like some of these other things, like this, the mental health and exercise, that's kind of more of a long-term study, right? That'd be something where we'd want to follow people over time. really interesting, really great topic. There's actually quite a bit of research out there, research around how uh, really kind of moderate aerobic exercise can be as effective as a low dose antidepressant. There's a lot of research that shows that. So it's really, Nicole, it's really great since I think you were one of the people that was interested in psychology too, right? Mental health, psychology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So
I've
really,
seen studies of meditation and mental health.
yeah, it's amazing. It's just really amazing the research that's being done in those areas. And what's really great is if you, in the future, if you end up being a mental health practitioner, you're going to have that information under your belt and those skills under your belt to really help people. Because I know, like, as when I had a counseling practice, um, because I had my health education background and my kind of exercise background, I was really able to help people with, eating disorders um, and mental health issues by integrating healthy foods, because that affects your brain chemistry, and integrating, so healthy diet, integrating healthy movement, trying to really shift perception of body image, really helping people find a more even place, really helping them to understand how the media works and how that can create distortions for their own perceptions of themselves, like how pretty much every magazine out there photoshops, like there's very rarely you're going to see a picture of a woman that's not photoshopped, and most men too, that's not photoshopped to make them look like unattainable, long neck, large breasts, small waist, large hips, big booty, you know, um, whatever they're looking for. It's like, and you can't attain that because, like, for most people, that's not even physically attainable. But people see that over and over and over and over again. And then they look at their body and they may be more of a mesomorph, like not much waist or not very large breasts or something. And as a woman, they're like, wow, there's something wrong with me, right? And or maybe they are overweight, or maybe they're not overweight, but they tend to carry more muscle mass on their body. I mean, these days, actually being more muscular is popular. It's popular. But like when I was a kid, that was not. I mean, it was like stick thin was in. Twiggy. In the early 70s. And so, that's not my body style. That's not my family's body style. So it's like you see these images over and over and over and over again, and you're like, wow, that's not really what my body looks like. And is that how my body's supposed to look? And that can kind of throw you into distortion, even if you have pretty healthy upbringing and all of that, it can really throw you, even different geographic locations. I've been really interested in, like, when I moved from New Mexico to Texas. In New Mexico, like growing up, it was like, didn't really matter if you were, what your body style was. Like, there was no like expectation, like whether you were tall or short or heavier or lighter or had large breasts or small breasts. I mean, like, that wasn't like a big deal. But when I moved to Texas, there is this expectation that you look a certain way. I really found a lot more pressure. I would have people tell me, well, if you would just lose a few pounds, you might be able to get a date. And I was like, what? Because I did not consider myself overweight. And so I was not overweight, but I found myself being like, well, maybe I do need to lose some weight, you know? So even a geographic location, when there's a lot of pressure, I have family that lives in the Houston, Texas area. And Catherine, you might be able to relate to this. I don't know, but there just felt like there was a lot of pressure on them to look a certain way. So geographic location can matter. Ethnicity can matter. We know that Black women tend to not be as worried about that. Why do you think Black women are not as worried about the whole like model thing? like the Twiggy. Why do you think that might be?
Well,
Catherine, what do you think? Are you willing to share with us?
yeah, for me, I know that with research, we know that Black people tend to be bigger than their peers. So, and also the BMI, you know, it's based off of white people.
Yes.
So I think that's the reason why people aren't too worried about it.
Yeah. And so it's like individuals who tend to carry more muscle mass on their body, they're going to, you know, like you said, BMI is designed for people that don't have a lot of muscle mass on their body. And so, and then the other thing is, and this is changing, but when you look at people, models in the media, up until about 10 or 15 years ago, the vast majority of them were white. And so Black women or Hispanic women, they just they didn't connect or relate with those models, you know, because there wasn't a lot of Hispanic or Black models. So they didn't really relate to that. And they were like, that's not really what I'm supposed to look like. They had different role models. Okay. Now we're seeing that shift. You know, we're seeing a lot more ethnic women that are becoming models. And we're actually seeing a shift in what's considered, you know, beautiful or sexy or whatever. So there's not as much the really stick thin, there's more the fit, there's more the it's okay. You're seeing more and more people in the media that hold a little bit more fat on their body, but that's healthy for them, that's natural for them. Or women that are very muscular. So they're larger, but and you know, a lot of people have a connotation around that large is bad. Large is not bad, right? You know, if you say a large woman, a lot of people think negative about that. Would you guys agree with that? You know, and that's, and, you know, I'm hoping with time we can shift that, okay? That large wouldn't be considered negative, you know, or a small man wouldn't be considered negative, right? So, so those are shifts, but those are things that we can see relate. Culture, perception, mental health is relating back to physical health because it's affecting people's food intake. You know, it's affecting some people purge through excessive exercise, right? That's unhealthy, you know? So I know I went on a major tangent, but you can see that's an interest that I have. That's a real interest that I have. Like, I want to understand that. I want to understand what we can do to work with children to help them to have healthy body images, no matter what socioeconomic place they come from, no matter what their culture, no matter what their ethnicity, no matter what their, and really no matter what their gender, because it happens to men and women. You know, it happens to all people. They can have issues with distorted body image. Okay, so those are things for us to think about, but that's something you have to think about when you do research. It's like, okay, what are all these factors? And then what am I going to look at? What data am I going to collect that's going to help me to have a better understanding of this process, to have a better understanding of what's helpful and what might be helpful for white people might not be as helpful for Black people or for Hispanic people, right? So we have to also be aware of that. Like, I can't just go in with some curriculum or something that's designed for white people and think it's going to work with Black people or Hispanic people or international people, right? And that happens. Sometimes people, you know, when we started doing international health education, they would take these programs that were developed in the United States and they would think that they could just take it to some international location and just do it. But it didn't work, right? Because they weren't honoring the traditions or the background or the culture of those people, that people group. They weren't trying to figure out like, okay, well, if I go in and start telling them to eat differently, that's not necessarily going to work for them, right? or if I go in there and start expecting them to act differently or have different patterns, health patterns, that's not necessarily going to work for them, especially if they feel judged, especially if they feel like I'm going to walk in and say like, well, what you're doing is wrong and unhealthy and bad for your kids. That's the worst thing you can do, right? So we know all of that through research. We know that that doesn't work, right? We have to go in and be culturally competent. We have to go in and find out what people's needs are, right? But that was all found out through research, right? Finding a problem, going, and then even trying to try a specific process or curriculum or project, and then analyzing it. Did this work? What worked about this? What didn't work about this? Were the people's needs met or were they not? You know, were people turned off by this? Were they offended? Did they connect? Was it helpful? So all of those things are really, really important. And that's where we go back to when we talked about measurement. That would be like that program level evaluation where we're trying to do research to find out what works and what doesn't work. Okay, is that all making sense? Is that kind of coming together? Okay, so I want to, as we move through the rest of this, I want to, could we move through this? Like, would you guys be okay doing something around? I want to combine something with like mental health with physical health, because it sounds like that's what's bubbling up. Or maybe education and I don't know, and health. So, I think it'd be good if we kind of started thinking about those things, because the project's going to come up really quick. And if we're going to do a survey, we need to start kind of working on it now so we can have it ready to deploy. Like maybe the third week of class, we could deploy the survey, and then we'll have our results. Okay, so does that sound okay to you guys? For us to be kind of working on that? Yes? So would you guys be okay with the, if we had to like vote, would you rather do the, eating disorder thing, like body image thing? Or would you rather do something around like education and maybe sexuality or something like that? What do you guys think? You can just use the chat function. Or is there something else you're really passionate about that you'd want to kind of explore? Because I'm open. I mean, there's no decisions made right now.
Dr. Fowles, I kind of have a question. And
Sure.
it kind of, so like what you said, like maybe 5 minutes ago. So when you were talking about how there's like a stigma between larger men and women, and how people, if you hear that, you automatically think like, ooh, do you think it's because that shows like 1,000-Pound Sisters, My 600-Pound Life, all those shows are so popular, or they were popular, that people automatically assume when you think of a larger man or woman, they automatically jump to, oh, they're like 600 pounds.
Yeah, that's a possibility. It's interesting because I've like never seen any of those shows because I don't even have cable on my TV. And I hear about like from my students, they'll tell me about like these shows about teenagers that are pregnant, or these shows about like all these different shows. And I'm like, wow, I should try to watch those, because it'd be really interesting just to see into those case studies of those individuals, or like men who really, really are attracted to larger women.
Mm-hmm.
Or like really very large women, like the 600-pound women or the 800-pound women. So that's really interesting too. So I don't know. I mean, I definitely think media has a huge effect on our perceptions. I really do. I mean, I think obviously our culture does too, or our family groups do definitely. But I think media has a really huge influence on our perceptions of what's acceptable or not acceptable, or what's desirable or not desirable. I really think it is. I think it does, but I don't know. Like, so for instance, there's people that really are in the media a lot. They're on social media a lot. They're on cable a lot. They're on, Twitter a lot, that kind of thing, versus someone like me who I'm just not on TV. I'm just not on, I do get on social media every once in a while to just see what my kids are doing. And so I'm not really influenced a lot by that, where someone else might be highly influenced by it because they're on it a lot. I think if I was on it a lot, I would be influenced because I think I'm a person that can be influenced. And some people are less influenced or they're less able to be influenced. Like some people are just like, I do my own thing. Like what you do is fine. I'm not influenced by anything. And then other people, like I admit, I'm highly influenced by the people around me because I'm an extrovert and I get input from other people and I'm highly influenced by the people around me. Where like my son is an introvert and he's not influenced really much by other people. Like if someone's unhappy with him, he's just like, sorry. And if someone's unhappy with me, I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened? What can I do? How can I make it better? He's just like, well, not my monkey. I'm not worried about it, So yeah, I definitely think that that culture and media has an influence over things. Definitely. Okay, so did everybody get a chance? So it looks like maybe the sexuality thing is kind of coming up. Okay, so maybe, maybe we could start exploring that. So what we would need to do is, like, I would like you guys between now and Monday to get out and research, try to find some articles about how maybe formal sexuality education affects people's sexual behavior in later life. See if we can find something about that. Okay. So as we go through this now, as I go through the lecture, I'm going to use that topic for the rest of our discussion. So we can kind of use that topic. And, if we get into the literature and we can't find much and we're really going like, how are we going to do this? We can always switch. We've got about a week to finalize what we're going to do. But I think this is a good start. Okay. So when we get into figuring out what's our research problem, so we're going to ask, will this add to the body of knowledge? So will our research be helpful? Will it help us make a decision? Will it add to the body of knowledge? Would it help, like, for instance, in this case, would it help schools have more information showing that either it's helpful or not helpful to do early sexuality education? Okay, so we would want to say, would that be helpful? Do you think it would be helpful to find out if early sexuality education is helpful for healthy, or sexual health? Do you think that could be helpful to schools to know that? Yeah, I definitely think that could add to the body of knowledge. Will it lead to further questions or new problems? Could that happen? Could it lead to further questions? Absolutely. We could do this and we could be like, okay, that was interesting, but that brings up more questions, right? That brings up more things that we might want to study. And that's part of the purpose of doing research, is to develop even new questions, right? Descriptive research, that's what it's for, is to develop new questions. Is the problem even researchable? Okay, so like there's some things like we might, like that idea around like, I don't know, there's some things that are hard to research. Like one thing that's really hard to do research on is family violence. It's a really hard thing to do research. It's hard to get access. It's hard to get honesty. It's difficult research to do. And like, that's not something we could do in this class, right? So like, I have a real interest in family violence and how that affects people's physical health too. Because I do know, like, because I have an interest in obesity, I do know that early abuse can affect people's body image, and a lot of people will become overweight as a protection factor. So early physical abuse or sexual abuse can be a factor in obesity. So yeah, but it's hard to research. It's a really, it's not impossible, but it's much more difficult to research. Okay. So like for us, we have to find something that could be easily researched in 2 weeks, right? Most research, I mean, some research studies take 20 years. So we're going to be doing something, you know, really quick that we can gather some data and something we can analyze. Hey, honey, are you on the internet? Yeah, I'm trying to have class. Okay, I'm so sorry, you guys. Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay, so Rachel Rummage found a study done on sexual education for early childhood. So yeah, it looks like there might be some stuff out there, okay? So then we want to get into stating a research problem and a hypothesis. So we would want to find out, like we talked about, does early sexuality education, so what do we want to know? Does it affect what? Our sexual perceptions or our actual behavior, the number of sexual partners? I mean, I don't know. What do you think we want to look at?
I would say perception. That would be interesting.
So perception around like, I don't know. And, you know, as we look in the literature, we might be able to find some surveys out there that have already been done, or like as we look at research, we might get some other variables that we want to look at. So it could be like, even, I know some people, another interesting question that comes up with sexual health is religion. You know, does that affect people's perception of sex? Even family, like what their parents' expectations were. I mean, there's all different kinds of things that can, I've seen studies, like I saw a really interesting study on like age of first sexual experience. And then like if their parents had had an early age of first sexual experience, how that affected that individual's decision about when they were going to have their first sexual experience, like at what age. So that's always interesting because we know that earlier sexual experiences can put people at more risk, not only physically, but also mentally. So, and spiritually, frankly. So that might be something, is even like age of first sexual experience. You know, I mean, this is an anonymous questionnaire. We'd have to think about, would people be willing to share that information? That's another thing you always have to think about if you're asking people their perceptions about sex or asking about their sexual behavior.
Maybe not that one, because that could also be like a trigger for people too.
Yeah.
Like being sexually abused.
Yeah, definitely could be. So that's something we would, you know, want to think about. That might not be a thing we want to jump into in just this short period of time. And that's the other thing, even just, you know, asking questions about sexual health. that could be, I mean, we're not going to publish this data or anything, so there's no risk of this, but we would want to make sure that it's not going to affect someone's mental health. So that would be something we would want to think about. Okay. So we would want to think about what kind of hypothesis, what are we looking at? Does early sexual education, like when we talk about perception of sex, do we want to have maybe there's some kind of scale of, healthy sexual perception scale. I don't know. Who knows? It could be out there. So maybe we could find something that we could use, because we don't have time to develop anything, that kind of thing. Okay. So we're going to be needing to develop a hypothesis. So I gave you some hypotheses here, like, does creatine supplementation improve strength, or does exercise reduce the risk for heart disease? We would be saying, does early sexual health education affect this, or improve this, or reduce this? Okay. So we would want to be looking at that. Okay. So we'll be needing to think about another variable for our study. What are we going to measure in order to see if we had a change, or if we had, or something descriptive that we could just describe, hey, in this group of people, like men had this perception versus women having this perception, or older people had this perception versus younger people had this perception. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then we're going to move down and talk about the population. So when we do a research study, then we have to decide, what population are we going to use? So we've decided we're going to use maybe college students. That's probably who you have the most access to, like being able to send it out to groups of people, but maybe not. Like Rachel Remage, I know you're connected to the veterans community, like the military community. I don't know if anybody else is connected to the military community. Because I was like, maybe if we had a couple of people that could send it out to military people, that could be one of our things. Maybe military people have a different perception than, I don't know, it might be interesting.
Actually,
Okay.
we could do
So we would
that.
want to decide who's going to be our population. So we're going to have, for this study, we're going to just have a convenience population. We're not going to have, we don't have necessarily access to one specific type of population, since all of you will be sending it out or trying to get feedback from people you know. I know last year when we did a survey, I also had a fairly small class last year, and I had several people just put it out on social media. So a lot of the people were just people she didn't even know. But she just asked for it to be people we were doing people between the ages of 18 and 30. So she just did, if you're between the ages of 18 and 30, would you be willing to fill this out, or send it to people you know that would fill it out? So that might be kind of up in the air right now too, but right now we could just say, for instance, we could say college students, okay, or young adults, ages 18 to 30, or adult population, if we decide we want to use a younger versus, like 18 to 30 and then 30 to 50, right? So depending on what kinds of data we can collect. So you need to choose your population. So some examples might be like football players. If we were going to do this study with creatine and strength, we would be doing our population would be football players. Our independent variable, what we're going to manipulate, would be the creatine, and our dependent variable would be the strength response. Like we would measure their strength. So this is the outcome variable that we're measuring, and the independent variable is what we're manipulating for an experimental study. Okay, make sense? Okay, so once we write the hypothesis, then we can determine whether it's a null hypothesis, where we're saying there won't be any difference, versus an alternative hypothesis, where we say there will be a difference. Okay, so you kind of have to choose, like, am I going to do a null hypothesis where I just go into this study and say there'll be no difference between the groups? Or am I going to say that I think this group is, if I think this group of football players, say I divide, or I have a control group and an experimental group, and I say, I think the players that take the creatine are going to have a higher 1 rep max bench press. Okay, so that's not a null hypothesis. That's an alternative or a directional hypothesis. I'm saying what I think is going to happen. I think that high school football players that take creatine will increase their 1 rep max bench press. Okay, so that's considered an alternative hypothesis versus there'll be no difference between the people that take the creatine versus the people that don't, the players that take the creatine versus the players that don't take the creatine, there'll be no difference in strength. That would be a null hypothesis. So if you're not sure of the outcomes, you would use a null hypothesis. But if you've kind of read about some things and you've looked at past studies and past correlational or descriptive studies have given you the indication that maybe, hey, these players that took creatine, they tend to be stronger. There's a correlation here. Then you would probably do an alternative hypothesis. You would probably say, I think creatine is going to increase strength. Okay? Okay, so we would have to write a hypothesis. And so once we get our problem nailed down a little bit better, we'll be developing some possible hypotheses. We can kind of talk about it. And then we have to, once we get our hypothesis, or we kind of know what our variables are and what our research interests are, then we want to do a lit review. Okay, so we want to get into the literature, and this is what you're going to be doing. So before Monday, you're going to be getting some articles on sexuality education in like either elementary, middle, or high school, and like see what people have studied about it. Whether they study like early sexual experiences, whether they study if it affects a number of sexual partners, or if it affects if somebody gets sexually transmitted disease. I mean, there's all different kinds of factors that might be involved. Okay, so we've got to do some lit review. We've got to find out what's already out there in the literature. Okay, what's already been studied, because we might have this great idea for a study, and then we get in the literature and then there's already 22 studies on that exact thing. Well, then do we need to do the study? If 22 people have already done the study, no, it's not. You're not adding anything more unless you're doing it with like a unique population, or you're doing it in a unique, different kind of situation. Okay, but there's a lot of topics that have been overstudied, right? So then you're like, maybe I don't need to do that. Maybe I need to do a different aspect. Maybe I need to look through their literature and see what other questions did they come up with. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to do a little lit review. So by Monday, hopefully you guys will each have 1 or 2 articles that you find, and we can have some more discussion about it. Okay, and I'll be making sure that the other students know that they need to do the same thing and bring it. Okay, so we're going to do a little lit review, and that might even change our hypothesis a little bit, or it might change our study a little bit about what we want to do. Okay, so just as a review, you're going to identify your population, and then you're going to have your independent variable, like something you might manipulate, and you're going to have dependent variable, something that you're going to be measuring. Now, for us, we may only have dependent variable, right? Because we're not necessarily going to be doing a experimental design. Okay, when you do survey research, that's more descriptive research. Okay, we're going to be describing, older adults versus younger adults, or military individuals versus non-military individuals, or whatever, men versus women. So we're not necessarily doing experimental study because we're not going to apply something that we manipulate. Does that make sense? Like, we're not going to take this group, put them into, randomly assign them, and then like expose them to a specific sexuality education curriculum and then measure them again at the end. That would be an experimental study, right? And we could do that if we had time. You know, we could give people, like, say, we could ask about their perceived risk of STDs. And then we could put them through a health education curriculum. And then we could, at the end, ask them, again, their perceived risk of STDs. And then we could have a control group that doesn't go through the curriculum, but we still measure them pre and post. And then we see, did that curriculum make a difference on whether they're going to use a condom or not, or whether they're going to delay sexual activity, or whether they're going to reduce the number of sexual exposures they have, something like that, right? So, but we're not going to be doing that. We're doing more descriptive research where we're just going to describe, like, these were people that had sexuality education and these are people that didn't. Did that change their perception, right? And then we could break it down even further. These were men that had sexuality education. These were men that didn't. Did that change whatever we decide to measure? Their perception, or their number of sexual partners, or their first sexual, their age of first sex, or whatever. Okay. So we're doing something more descriptive. So we're not going to necessarily have a manipulation variable. Okay. We're not going to be manipulating it, but we can say, like in a descriptive study, we could say the sexuality education is our independent variable. And then the dependent variable would be the outcome, whatever it is, right? It could be the number of sexual partners they've had, or it could be if we find some scale of sexual health, like they're more sexually healthy than someone else. I don't know. We're going to have to look and see what's out there. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Any questions? Okay, so how are you guys feeling? Do you need a little break?
I posted a question in the comments.
Okay. Oh, so would we do the survey on a website such as SurveyMonkey or something similar? Absolutely. So I'm thinking we would do a SurveyMonkey survey. I do have SurveyMonkey, the professional version. So we can develop a SurveyMonkey survey, and then we would have a link, and everybody would just have a link they could send out. That just makes it super easy, because then all I have to do is download the data off of SurveyMonkey onto Excel. Boom, we've got the data, right? So it makes it a lot easier to collect information. Okay. So do you guys feel like you need a little break, or should we just stand up and stretch a little bit, or? Okay, so let's stand up and just do a stretch, or if somebody needs to get a drink of water, so just a couple of minutes. So if somebody needs a drink of water, I know for me, just standing up is helpful.
And Carol, I have a meeting at 12 with my internship, so I'm gonna have to go soon.
Okay, that sounds good. So Rachel, let's talk about your questions since you're gonna have to leave.
Oh yeah, but I was thinking about it, and I don't know if I can ask because it was on the homework.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna, I might have said this before you got on, but tomorrow I am willing to bring the homework up and kind of talk about, go through some items and kind of talk about some of the items.
Okay,
we can't really do that right now since the homework's not due until the end of the day.
That's what I was realizing. I was like, I can't ask that.
Yeah. So, so we can do that tomorrow.
Okay, awesome.
Okay. And then, if I were you, I would I'm going to run through the rest of this stuff is pretty straightforward. That's in the lecture. It's just specifically about the designs. So you need to make sure you do a good job looking over that. Like, how do you select a design? And then descriptive, there's different kinds of descriptive research. And then there's different kinds of experimental research. Okay.
Oh, cool.
So you need to be familiar with those. And then I just have some little information about how to do a lit review, but all of you said you were pretty comfortable with that. So I'm probably not even going to go over that.
Okay. Awesome.
And then we were going to bring up homework 2, practice homework 2. So if you wanted to get back on and just watch the end of the video, that might be helpful for you.
Yeah, definitely.
just as I go through practice homework 2. It's similar to practice homework 1. It's looking at some abstracts and then determining like, what's the research design, what are the variables, you know, things like that.
And then the homework 2 and the quiz 2 are due tomorrow, right?
They're due by the end of the day tomorrow.
Okay, cool.
Although, you know, I was thinking I would make them due by the end of the day on Friday.
Okay.
Just give
Cool.
you guys an extra day to kind of prepare. And I mean, if you want to do them right away, it's fine too. But I think I'm going to change that and make the due date on the 10th. In fact, I think I already did it because I was like, wow, that's really quick. Like turn around one day. So, so homework 2 and quiz 2 are due by the end of the day on Friday.
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
Awesome.
So, and Rachel, if you have any questions come up, please feel free to just reach out.
Okay, awesome. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Okay.
Okay,
Have fun
bye.
at your meeting. Okay, so let's just go through and kind of talk about some of these research designs. So these are oh, I need to talk about validity first though. So validity is really, really important in research. Okay, so validity basically just says, is something measuring what it intended to measure? Okay, so probably the best example I could give you is if I wanted to measure body fat, what tool would I use? What do you guys think? If I wanted to measure body fat, do you guys know what tool I could use?
Use the
Skin fold calipers?
yeah, that.
Yeah.
So
So you could use a skin fold calipers. You could use a bod pod. So there's different things. So would I use a scale to measure body fat?
No.
No. What does a scale measure?
Wait.
Weight. Okay. So a scale is a valid tool to measure weight. So a scale has good validity for weight. It will actually measure weight, okay? Where a skinfold caliper is not a good tool for measuring weight. It's not valid. It does not measure weight. It could give you a great valid measurement for body fat, but it's not valid for measuring weight. Okay, so does that make sense? So we want to make sure that what we're doing is actually measuring what we're trying to measure, okay? Because sometimes people use the wrong tool. They don't use a tool, they don't collect data in the right way, okay? So we want to make sure something's valid, that it's measuring what it's intended to measure. And we also, as part of a validity is we want to get rid of error, okay? So we want to try to get rid of error. So what if I have a scale? Have you guys ever had a scale that like didn't work very well? I don't know if you've ever had a scale like that. Like I had a scale one time where like I would stand on it and it would say one weight, and then I would get off and then I would stand on it again and it would say a different weight. Like it would say a weight 2 pounds higher. Then I would get off and I would get back on and it would say a weight 2 pounds lower. Well, it was still measuring weight, but it wasn't very reliable. Okay, so it had poor reliability. Okay, so it wasn't really measuring weight well because it wasn't reliable. And that affected the validity because there was a bunch of error. Okay, so it wasn't really telling me what my true weight was. And, you know, like we tend to like get on there and then like when it said what I wanted, I'd be like, okay, great. That's the weight. That's the weight I kind of wanted. So, but that's error. Okay. So most tools have error in them. Okay. So when we look at validity, there's 2 different kinds of validity. There's internal validity, and the internal validity basically says, is the design you chose actually influencing the measure of the treatment influence? So does it measure the influence of the treatment, or are other factors causing a change? Okay, so, you know, I might, like, for instance, say someone's in a weight loss program with me. I'm doing a weight loss program. And so I've got this curriculum and I'm trying to figure out if this curriculum works. But then later I find out that somebody was also doing Weight Watchers while they were in my program. Okay, well, that lowers the internal validity, right? Because maybe it was the Weight Watchers that helped them lose weight, not my program. Okay, so or maybe they were influenced by something else. So we have to control for those factors that could cause noise, okay, or cause error. So if I can control those factors, so how do you think I can control factors so there's not bias or error? Okay, so one of the things I can do, we talked about 3 things yesterday about experimental research. Do you guys remember any of them? 3 things you need to do that it would be considered experimental. Anybody? You guys are going to need to know this. Okay, so for a good experimental design, remember we talked about like the titles of the articles? What words were we looking for? So we thought we would think it was experimental.
Randomization.
Okay, so randomization. So if I randomize, I am reducing error. Okay, because let's say I just let people self-select into a group. What if I said exercise, that my hypothesis is that exercise will influence cholesterol level. And then I just said, okay, choose if you want to be in the exercise group or the non-exercise group. Could that create bias? Absolutely, because the people that love to exercise are going to choose the exercise group. Well, maybe there's something else about exercisers. Maybe there's some other factor that actually would influence cholesterol besides exercise. Maybe people that exercise also tend to eat better, you know, and maybe that influences their cholesterol. So we don't want to influence, or we don't want to bias the groups by letting them self-select. So we would want to randomize, right? We would want to randomly put them in the exercise or the non-exercise group. Okay, so randomization can control and make our study more valid, more internally valid. Okay, what was another thing? So randomization was one. What was another? Anybody? Courtney, Adriana, Nicole, do you remember one of the other things? Rachel? So we had randomization. What else? What are the other things? What, Nicole?
Would it be like looking for like a control group?
Absolutely. So having a control group, that also reduces bias, because if I have a group that's not getting the experimental, you know, process, and I have a group that is, then that's going to reduce bias, right? Because I'm randomly assigning them, and there's going to be less error. I can really tell that, hey, the change really was because of our program in the experimental group versus the people that didn't get it. Okay, so we know randomization, we know the control group, and then there's that last one that's not quite as important, but it's still there. Do you guys remember? Randomization, control group, and Rachel Rummage, you actually put it on your question. The question you just asked?
Increase or decrease?
The survey?
So what about the survey? What did you want to do to make it better?
Oh, blind survey.
Yeah, so blinding it, right? So if it's blinded, then that reduces error, that reduces bias. It makes it a stronger study, which makes it have better internal validity. So when you see internal validity, that's going to be based on, is there randomization or a control group? Okay, those are the two main things. But then also, is there blinding? That would help. Okay, so randomization in a control group, that makes it a strong internally valid study. And also if you can have blinding, okay? External validity is about, does this design, can you generalize to a larger group? Okay, so is your study large enough, and does it have enough diversity? So if I do my study with 8 white men from Duluth that are over 60, can I generalize that to all men? Probably not, okay? So that has poor external validity because it only has 8 people who are all the same, okay? So that might be generalizable. It might have some generalizability to old white men, okay? But it's still kind of small. Even just 8 people, that's kind of small for us to say, oh, I can generalize this information to a larger population, right? So external validity is all about the size of your sample. Okay, it's all about the size of your sample. So the larger your sample size is, the better your external validity will be. Okay, does that make sense? So if I only have 8 people, I might not get all the information I need versus if I have 800 people. I'm going to get better outcomes to really see what's going on with that larger population. So if I take a sample of 800 people versus a sample of 8 people, then it's more generalizable. Okay, I can really say, hey, this is probably true for this population of people, right? So if I do 800 people, 800 men over 60, I'm going to get all kinds of men, right? I'm not going to just get white men. I'm going to get all kinds of different men, right? So that's going to then make me be able to say, this is more generalizable to men over 60 in general, versus then if I just do 8 white guys. Okay, make sense? Okay, so external validity is all about your sample size. How big is your sample size? The larger, the better, okay? The more people you have in your sample, the more you can say, I have good external validity. I feel good about this, okay? Make sense? So internal validity, randomization, and control group, and possibly blinding. External validity, sample size. Larger sample size makes it better, okay? So as we select a research design, we're going to be trying to decide, hey, are we just doing descriptive research or experimental research? Okay. So what are we looking at? Are we just trying to gather data and do some descriptions and find some research questions? Or do we already have a really set research question that we can get a control group and do some randomization, and we can try to answer a question? Okay. So like for our research, we don't necessarily have a research question in mind, right? We're trying to collect some information, right? We're just trying to say, like, let's collect some information that might be something that could be a long-term study, a longitudinal experimental study, okay? But we're probably going to be doing descriptive research. But if somebody wanted to do experimental research, they would need to look at, like, what are influences on our dependent variable? What are control variables we need to be aware of, okay? Who's our population? How do we get access to them? What's our independent variable? How are we going to manipulate it? How are we going to measure our dependent variable? What are our limitations, right? Do we have limitations on how much this is going to cost, or how much time it's going to take, or tools that we can use to collect the data, okay? So these are all questions you ask ahead of time. You know, it's like, we have a lot of limitations in this class. We have a time limitation. We can't meet in person, so we can't do something where we have to meet in person. You know, we have a money limitation. I don't have a bunch of money I can go out and spend on, you know, buying equipment or that kind of thing. So we have a lot of limitations we're not going to be doing experimental research. So we have to look at all these questions before we start a study. Okay. So if somebody decided to do a descriptive study, there's different kind of designs in descriptive studies. Okay. So in descriptive studies, someone could do a case study. Okay. A case study is a single individual experience. Okay. So it's an isolated phenomenon. It's like one. Okay. So it's the study of one person or one group. Okay. That would be a case study. Okay. This happens a lot in medicine where they have like some anomaly happening with some disease and they're going to study like one person or one person group. Okay. But it's one. Okay. So what do you think that does to external validity? Will you have good external validity or poor external validity? If you have a case study, one.
Or
Yeah, so poor external validity, right? One person or one group, right? Versus if I had a large group, that's not a case study. A case study is only one person or one group, okay? So it's not really generalizable, okay? It's more useful to observe like phenomena in individuals. Like, someone like Janet, what's her name? She was a swimmer. I'm blanking on her name. But anyway, she was not your typical swimmer. Like she didn't have like the long body, long arms, that kind of thing. But she was an Olympian. And they were like, and she looked like she was just splashing around in the water. She didn't even look smooth or anything. Janet Evans, I just thought of it. And so they did some case studies on her, like what makes her be able to do that? Like how can she be so fast, even though she doesn't have the right body style, she doesn't have the normal technique. So, that was a case study. They just looked at that one thing, okay? Another thing that can be done is a group study. Okay, this is the most common, is doing a group study where you're looking at relationships in either one group or two groups that you might compare, two related groups. It allows you to do some statistical probability. It allows you to do some generalizations, okay, because you can use a little bit larger group with a group study, okay? And it allows the development of some experimental questions, okay? So in group study, you can do comparative group studies. So this would be comparing existing groups, okay? So this, again, it allows for the formulation of experimental questions. It can also be developmental. It can be like looking at groups over a specific period of time. So if you do a developmental study, okay, this could be cross-sectional. So you could look at like Pueblo, and then you could look at either one point in time, that would be like a cross-sectional for time, or you could look cross-sectionally across like ages. Like you could look at one point in time over, a specific age group, okay? But a cross-sectional basically is just slicing across the population and usually is at one point in time, okay? Tends to be a little weaker because it doesn't it's just look at developmentally from at this point in time, 6-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 26-year-olds, 56-year-olds, right? It's just a cross-sectional across time and looking at the development. But it's not looking at one person over time, okay? Which would be longitudinal. This tends to be a little stronger. So like taking 6-year-olds and then following them, like with our study, if we could take 6-year-olds and we could follow them all the way until they're 30, and we could look at all of the different educational experiences that they have, whether it's in schools or with their parents or families, or whether it's from the media. Like what kind of sexual education are they getting? And is it valid, right? Are they getting their sex education from the media? Are they getting it from Hustler magazine? Are they getting it from their church? Where are they getting their sexuality education? So, we could follow someone longitudinally over time. There's been some longitudinal studies that are like 20, 30 years, and then there's some that are like maybe 8 to 16 weeks. Okay, but that's considered more of a longitudinal study versus just doing a one point in time, which is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing a comparative group study, okay, and it's going to be cross-sectional, right? Because we're just looking at one period of time. Okay, make sense? So it's a little bit weaker. For it's not going to do any causality, right? We're not going to be really showing any causality. Okay. And descriptive research can be retrospective, so we can look back. It can be current, which is what we'll be doing, or it could be prospective, which is following a group over time. Okay. So we're going to be measuring their current perceptions, or, you know, but we could say we might do some retrospective things, because we might say like, how many sexual partners have you had in your lifetime? Well, that's kind of retrospective. Okay. So they could tell us that, or, you know, whatever. So studies can be done with data that happened in the past, data that's currently happening, or follow over time, which would be the longitudinal. Okay. So those are the different types. So you need to be aware of that. Case study, one person. Okay. Group study, larger group, that can be just a one-shot thing. It can be developmental as a cross-sectional, or it could be developmental that's longitudinal. Okay. It could be in the past, current, or in the future, following along longitudinally. Okay. So the tools that are usually used to collect data, things like document analysis. So looking at records like human resource records or medical records. We could look at trend analysis. This could be examining patterns of changes in variables that occur over time, like how much people smoke over the last, you know, the smoking rates over the last 75 years. Something like that would be a trend analysis. We talked about what's considered sexually attractive over time, right? So we know over time that changes. From the Middle Ages up until 2020, there's been a lot of different, like, what is considered attractive, right? There's trends in that. We could do a trend analysis. We could do a correlation, and that's looking for relationships. We talked about that yesterday, where how do the variables vary? Do they vary together? Do they both go up at the same time? A positive correlation? Does one go up and the other go down? A negative correlation? But is there a relationship? Okay. But remember, relationship doesn't prove causation. It doesn't prove one variable causes the other. That's really important to remember. So just because there's more sales of ice cream, that doesn't cause drownings. Okay. There's other variables involved. Okay. But we know there's a relationship. Okay. And then we can also use simple correlation, or we can use something called regression, which is a type of predictive equation. And you're going to be learning about that, but it's part of relationships. Okay. We could collect surveys. That's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be a group study. Okay. That's a current group study that's survey based. The tool we're going to use is a survey. Or we could do an epidemiological study, which is the study of a large population in their disease process. Okay? So those are the types, or the commonly used techniques. Okay? Make sense? So someone could do a group study that's longitudinal and that's epidemiological, where we're like studying a disease over a long period of time with a group of people. Like the Corellia heart disease study. It was a 20-year study about heart disease. It was descriptive research. There was a group study that was longitudinal, okay, prospective, and it was an epidemiological study. Okay, our study is going to be a group study that's current, that's a survey. Okay, are you seeing that? Okay, so you need to be familiar with those pieces. So that's descriptive research. right? It's describing, it's coming up with questions. It can use qualitative as well as quantitative data, okay? It usually develops additional questions, okay? Descriptive data, as well as you can do inferential data. You can do some comparisons, okay? But when we drop down to experimental research design, the classic experimental design uses a control group and a treatment group, okay? So we're back to this, randomization, control group, and you can also have blinding, okay? So that's the classic experimental design, okay? So what they have on the classic experimental design, just so you guys can see it, so what they have in a classic experimental design is you've got your pre-test, right? And then you have your post-test, right? And then you're going to have your, oops, I don't want my underline here. You're going to have your control group, and you're going to have your experimental group. So let me actually back these up a little bit. Okay, so this is a classic design. I've got a control group that I measure pre, and I've got an experimental group that I measure pre, and then I'm going to have my treatment in here. Okay, that's my treatment. So the experimental group, they get the treatment, right? But the control group doesn't get the treatment. So this is a classic design. Okay, so the control group, we measure them at pre. So we measure them at pre, so we get a measurement here. Oops, we get a measurement here at pre. We get a measurement here for the experimental group at pre. Then the control group has no intervention. The experimental group has an intervention. And then we do a measurement at post and a measurement at post. Okay? So that's a classic experimental design. Control group, experimental group, and you're going to have randomization. That's the other thing. People, your sample will be randomly assigned to the control group, and randomly, you'll have random assignment to the control group and the experimental group. Half to the control group, half to the experimental group. So classic experimental design. Okay? Make sense? Okay? So that's your classic experimental design. Now, this can be a between measures design. Okay, so this is a measuring groups. Okay, measuring groups. So this could be, the between is the pre-measure between control and experimental. So this is the between measurement. If I were to assess the difference between the controls at pre and the experimentals at pre, that would be a between two groups, okay? If I were to assess the difference between the controls at post versus the experimental at post, that would be considered a between, okay? Between two groups. Okay, do you guys see that? Between two groups. The within design, the within design, which is would make a mixed design, that would measure within the group, the control pre to post. That's one group, two measures, pre to post. That's considered within the group. Okay, the between is between two groups, pre control and experimental, or post control and experimental. Okay, so that's between. The within is within that one group pre to post, or within the experimental pre to post. Okay, so that's the difference between between and within. Okay, there's also something called a repeated measure, which is the within, right? Within, I repeat the measures, and I could have another. I could have a post 2 or a post 3. So that's the within. Or we can do what's called a mixed design, and that it does both. It measures the between, the within, and the within. So classic experimental does all of that. It's called a mixed design, mixed measure design. It measures between and within, okay? So now, like with our study, we're probably only gonna have one group. We're not gonna have a control group. So we're having one group, and we might divide them up into different characteristics, but we're gonna have one group. So we're only gonna be doing some within measures. We're not gonna be necessarily doing between with a control group, okay? We could do some between like men and women, and you can sort of consider that between, but it's not experimental, okay? Because experimental is when you have the control group, okay? And then there's a factorial design, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But then you need to know this, the quasi-experimental, these are the ones that lack randomization, or they lack existing, they just use existing intact groups, and they lack blinding, okay? So this is just, there's no randomization, okay? You could still have a control group, but you're just letting them self-select. Okay, so that's considered quasi-experimental. Or the pseudo-experimental is when you only have one group. Okay, so that would be like our study. If we were going to be doing something more experimental, we only have one group. We don't have a control group. Okay, so that would be considered pseudo, but we're not doing experimental design, so it doesn't matter. But if you only have one group, that's considered pseudo-experimental. The quasi-experimental is when you don't have randomization. Okay? Questions about any of that? I know we've lost some people that had to go to meetings and stuff, but Nicole or Adriana, do you guys have any questions? Okay, so I'm going to pull up homework 2 so we can take a look at homework 2. So for those of you watching on the recording, we're going to go now to the homework 2. So let me, oh, Rachel and Courtney and Catherine, you're still here. I didn't see you. So are you guys all good?
Mhm.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's go and let's look at homework 2. So let me bring that up. If I can get that to come up. And then I'll screen share again. So any other questions you guys might have? Okay, so on the practice homework for homework 2, it's taking me a second for it to come up on Blackboard. So the practice homework, we're going to be doing something very similar for homework 2. So we're going to be bringing up, you're going to be actually going out and finding an article. So I'm going to give you, so what will happen, I'm trying to remember exactly what happens in the actual homework. I'm pretty sure this is what happens in the actual homework. I'm going to look once my Blackboard will respond. I think what happens is I give you the authors and the title of the article, and then you have to go look it up. Okay, so that's going to measure whether you can do the research, whether you can actually look up an article. Okay, so it's going to have you look up the article, and then the questions are going to be about getting that article pulled up. Okay, so it's a specific article that I'm giving you that you've got to look up, and you can look that up through the Academic Search Premier on our library website, or you can look that up on Google Scholar, because I am giving you, I do give you the actual authors and title of the article. but I'm gonna make sure of that once I get into here. So I'm getting into the module and getting into practice homework 2. So let me pull that up. And then I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. Okay, please come up. Okay. Do any of the rest of you have practice homework 2 up? For some reason, my computer's just lagging. Okay. You can do it. Let me see if I can download it one more time. Okay, so I want to point out to you also as while we're waiting that I do have the website to the library linked on Blackboard. So it takes you right to the library website. So that's good. And then you can go into the databases, the search engines, and hopefully get into that. I really find that the Academic Search Premier tends to be a really good, just overall basic search engine to use. Now, if you're going to use, if you're going to be doing some medical-based research or that kind of thing, oh, I'm finally getting it. If you're going to do some other kinds of research, it is valuable to use something like Medline or some of the other medical, or if you're doing something psychological, there's Cyclit. If you're doing something with education, there's the their specific education-based websites that you can use. So, you know, if you're not finding what you need, just like on a general search engine like Academic Search Premier, you can try looking on one of those more specific search engines and see if that will work. So, okay, I'm finally up. So let me do, let me see if I can get back to the share screen. The bad thing is then it pulls up like 5 copies because I've just been clicking on it and clicking on it. So, okay. Okay, so let me get back to share screen. And okay, are you guys seeing it? No? Oh, it's still working. Okay, so on the practice homework, it's asking you to go and look up, to get onto EBSCOhost, which is basically Academic Search Premier. It has 2 names. So if you go to the library website and you search for soccer injuries and athletic training, we can find an article on that. And then, so what you're going to want to do for your practice homework is go out and find a article on soccer injuries and athletic training, and then try to figure out what type of study is this? What population does it address? What are the most common injuries? When do they occur? Okay, so I'm so frustrated that my technology is not working. You guys can pull this up on, on your computers. That might help so you can see it, since my share screens just doesn't seem to be coming up. But then the one that we would be doing together, so that's the one you would do on your own. The one that we would be doing together, okay, I don't know what it's doing now. Okay, so can you see it now? You guys can see it now? Okay, so so soccer injuries and athletic training, okay? So then the second one we'd be doing together is a Medline search, Medline database search, but you can probably find this on Google Scholar too. So I actually give you, I actually give you a study to look at. So here's a study about heart failure status and psychosocial variables to moderate the relationship between leisure time physical activity and mortality risk among patients. So you would go out and you would find this article. So I give you the names of the authors and the title of the article, okay? So you would pull this article up, and then you would determine what type of article is this, okay? Is this an experimental study, or is this a descriptive study? So let's just look at the title. Do heart failure status and psychosocial variables moderate the relationship between leisure time physical activity and mortality risk among patients with a history of myocardial infarction? Okay, so we're looking at the words that are in the title. Okay, so do you guys see any of those primary words that we normally would be looking for? Are you seeing randomization? Do you see anything about it being randomized? No. Okay. Are you seeing anything about it having a control group? No. Does it have a control group? No. Okay, we don't see a control group. Does it have blinding? Do you see anything about it being blinded? No. Okay, so just from the title, we can tell that this is probably not an experimental design, but we don't know for sure until we actually, would pull the article up. Okay, so once we would pull the article up, then we would have the ability to determine, is this an experimental versus a descriptive study? Okay, so I'm going to be having you guys look at, I'm going to be having you guys pull up the, gosh, why is this happening? Okay, I'm going to be having you guys pull up the article. Okay, so can someone pull that article up? Like, could you just go on the library or EBSCOhost? Would somebody be willing to pull that article up? Is someone looking? Rachel, are you looking for it? Okay. So you should probably be able to find it just in Google Scholar, or if you go onto the library, you should be able to find it pretty easily. If not, I can pull it up really quick. But I like to have a student do it because it's just a little bit more interactive.
Okay, so I clicked on the article on the school's library website. Do you want me to?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you, Rachel, I'm going to give you control right now.
Okay.
Oh, wait, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do, I want to give you the ability to share the screen, to share your screen. Okay, so Rachel, don't do anything with your mouse because you're controlling my screen right now.
Sorry.
I gave you the ability to control my screen. It's just so frustrating that, because normally if my technology works really fast, then this is good. Okay, so Rachel, can you go to stop share?
Where's that at?
The red thing. Can you see where the cursor is?
Yeah, right here.
Can you click on stop share?
I clicked on this and I think that's the recording button, but I don't see a stop share.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it might be that my computer's just not responding. Okay, so talk about the article, since I'll work on this so you can do a screen share, but what does it say? Give us an overview.
Trying to find, okay, full text is available. We'll go here. Okay. I guess I'll have to accept all the cookies. So it's, you want me to read like the background or the method or the results?
Yeah, just tell us a little bit about the methodology.
Okay, so it says the participants were from a multi-center perspective cohort study. Information on LTPA. It says non-irregular 1 to 150, 151 to 300, and then greater than 300 weekly minutes. Depression, social support, and other prognostic, I think that's how you say it. Indicators were collected 10 to 13 years after the index MI. Cox regression was conducted, adjusting the potential confounders in case of significant modification by HF status or psychosocial variables. Stratified analysis was performed, is the methods section.
Okay, so did we see anything in there about a control group or about randomization?
Well, there, I guess it was, they didn't really have a control group per se, but they kind of did because they were all from the same cohort, like a multi-center cohort.
Yeah, so they really didn't, we really didn't see a control group, right? So there wasn't a group, there wasn't like any variable that they were manipulating, right?
They were just observing these
Right.
two.
So what do you guys think? If you had to guess at this point about this study, do you think it's descriptive or experimental? How many people think it's experimental? How many people think it's descriptive? Okay, I also think it's descriptive, okay? So it's descriptive because what it's doing is it's describing the effects of of I'm sorry, it's describing the effects of the trying to get back to where it is. The hormonal response, right? It's just describing what's happening. Okay, so I'm trying to get back to that study that we're doing. Okay, right here. So it's describing the psychosocial variables that moderate the relationship between leisure time, physical activity, and mortality risk. So the other reason why we would think this is descriptive is it's talking about relationships, okay? So usually descriptive research is going to be looking at correlation or regression, which are relationships, where the experimental research is going to be talking about differences. Okay, makes sense?
And their conclusion said that the leisure time physical activity was inversely related to mortality risk of post-MI patients. Heart failure did not moderate the relationship. Depression and social support partially did.
Okay, so what type of study is this, Rachel? Is it descriptive or is it experimental?
It's descriptive.
Yes, so this is a descriptive study, mainly because there was no randomization, there was no control group, there was no blinding, there was no manipulation of a variable. Okay, they didn't actually give one group the variable and the other group didn't get the variable, right? So we know this is not experimental, it's descriptive. Okay, what population does it address?
People who have heart failure and myocardial infarction.
Right, which is basically heart attack. Okay, so this group, the population was heart patients. Okay, patients with a history of heart attack. Okay, and then the question: do middle-aged adults who engage in leisure time activity have a lower risk of heart attack?
Yes.
Okay, so we saw an inverse relationship, right? We talked, so the more leisure time, the less heart attack, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we saw that relationship, but does this mean that exercise causes a reduction in the risk of heart attack?
No.
What'd you say, Rachel?
I said no.
No, it doesn't necessarily tell us causation. Okay, why is that?
Because the cause of a heart attack could be genetics, it could be diet, it could be lack of exercise, it could be a lot of things. And they didn't.
But why do we know from this study that we can't say, we're saying no, we can't say that exercise causes a reduction in the risk of heart attack? Why can we say that for this study?
Because of the data that they collected from the participants.
Right, because the data they collected was descriptive. It wasn't experimental, and it was only relationship oriented, right? It was only relationships. It didn't actually measure causation, right? Which the only way you can get causation is through experimental research.
Mhm.
Okay, so descriptive research is not going to tell you causation. Okay, does that make sense?
Mhm.
So if you have descriptive research, that's not causation. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
So how could we prove the hypothesis? What will we have to do to prove that leisure time physical activity reduces heart disease risk? What do you think we could do, Rachel? What could we do to show causation?
You could do a longer study and then just have like one group do leisure time activity and then one group not, and then compare the two groups.
Right. So what kind of a study would that be?
But the thing, because it's comparative.
What kind of study would it be?
I'm trying to find like the exact word for it.
Well, you choose from descriptive or experimental.
That would be experimental.
Right. Okay. So what you described is experimental, and you would be doing a classic design. If you randomly assigned people to two groups, one group got the leisure time activity over time, and the other group didn't, and then you measured it again, the risk again at the end, right? That's a classic experimental design. Okay, so this first design, this is not a causation design. This is a design of descriptive research. Okay, makes sense? Does that make sense for everybody? Okay, I've lost my chat with all this moving stuff around. So you'll need to actually talk if you have a question.
Did you see that Catherine put that she had to leave, but she'll watch the recording later?
Okay. No, there's no other questions on the chat?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, so any other questions about how we moved through this article? Okay, so that's what you would do for the rest of them, right? For this one, I want you to pull up the article. So either go to the library website and look the article up, or go into Google Scholar and look the article up, read the abstract, and then figure out what type of study is this? Is this experimental or descriptive? Who's the population? What are the independent variables, dependent variables? Is this a strong design? So like this one, just from the title, acute hormonal responses to heavy resistance exercise in strength athletes versus non-athletes. Okay, so that kind of gives you a little bit of a feel that you're comparing two groups. Okay, now that doesn't for sure tell you it's experimental, but it gives you a feel that it might be experimental. Okay, so you would want to go in and look and say, is there any randomization? Is there any blinding in this? Were they manipulating a variable? Okay, it seems to me like they might have some manipulation in the heavy resistance exercise. Okay, so just from the title, I can say I know the population are athletes and non-athletes. Okay, I'm going to guess that this is experimental. If I had to look at the variables, I would say that the outcome variable is going to be the hormonal response, and the independent variable is the resistance exercise. Okay. And then the way I would tell whether it was a strong design or not is whether it had randomization, whether it has a control group, whether it has blinding. Okay. and then you'll be able to answer these questions. So, and then I have the answers for you to all three down here. Okay, so you can go, you really need to go and look those abstracts up and test yourself. Go through it, you know, test yourself and say, don't look at the answers yet, actually go through and test. Am I able to see that this is experimental, who the population is? Can I answer these questions? Does the use of heavyweight training increase hormonal production? Does the use of weight training induce neuromuscular fatigue? You know, can I actually answer those questions out of the article? And then, is this a between, a within, or a mixed measure design? So are they only measuring pre and post in the control group, or pre and post in the experimental group? Okay, that would be a within. Or are they looking at pre, between the control and the experimental, and post between the control and experimental? That would be between. Or are they doing both? And in a classic experimental design, they're going to usually do both. So like you can come down here and see that, yes, this is a mixed model. Okay. Yeah. So you need to look those up and move through those so you feel like, okay, I feel an understanding of this. If you have questions, then you can bring those questions tomorrow. Okay. And then we can kind of talk through it before you go to the actual homework. So in the actual homework, it's going to be the same thing. I'm going to give you the title and the authors. You'll have to look the article up, review it, review the abstract, and then answer the questions in the homework. Okay? Any questions? Okay, I'm assuming there's no questions. Does anyone see a question in the chat box?
No, there's no question.
Yes.
No, there's no question.
Oh, no questions. Okay, so what are you going to do by the end of today? You're going to make sure you've done homework 1 and quiz 1. Okay, so that has to be done by the end of the day today to be able to get your grades for those assignments. Okay, and then tomorrow we're going to go over lecture 3, and it's on, basically it talks about Excel and using technology, which is kind of ironic since my technology isn't working. So we'll be going over that, but the quiz and the homework for lecture 2 isn't going to be due until Friday. And then for lecture 3, I'll probably have it due the end of the day on Monday. Okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, so it was great to see you guys today. Thanks for being patient with me with all of the challenges I'm having with technology. I do have them working on my computer at the office, so I'm hopeful that by the time we get to maybe tomorrow or maybe Monday, I'll have all this, all these glitches worked out. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 10:30, and have a wonderful day.